Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of the time to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud.
Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. I'll just say, I think this is what makes progress hard on this front. The idea that we can't have a conversation on government policies that have been put in place. My intent, in my opening remarks, I acknowledged many of the things that have been talked about, the stain on our nation's history that we have in some ways moved past, but there will continue to be work to be done. It's sad and sickening that in a fallen world, in a nation as diverse as ours, and we are one of the most diverse nations in the world, there still remain people who cling to old, racist, ignorant ideologies. My concern is that the way this has been implemented into many of the agencies in our federal government, this has been listed as the #1 agenda in agencies that are supposed to be doing other things. Yesterday, Mr. Burleson mentioned FEMA. And one of the things is they're trying to weigh someone's religion and how they give out aid. That's crazy. That kind of stuff shouldn't be happening in the United States of America. There's research that's gone into this. Journalist and researcher Jesse Singal wrote in the New York Times that there's very little evidence that many of the initiatives work. The specific type of diversity training that is currently in vogue, mandatory training that blames dominant groups for DEI problems, may well have a net negative effect on the outcome managers claim to care about. Forbes senior editor Jenna McGregor wrote, compulsory diversity training aimed at people's biases or preventing discrimination behavior appears to actually do more harm than good. I did not benign the intents or the motivations in these policies, but what we are finding and what businesses are finding now, a number of them have implemented these policies and realizing they're not working. They're not accomplishing the desired ends for us to continue to move toward a more perfect union. And that's why we're seeing a retraction from them. My concern is getting our federal government to a place where race and sexism and all these things are not the first thing we look at in our hiring, in our grant writing, in our contracting. I think it would make us a better country.
All right, gentlemen, time's expired. Chair now recognizes Ms. Tlaib from Michigan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You know, I sometimes remind people I grew up in the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, the city of Detroit, because I need you to understand sometimes your lens becomes different when you're in a community just embodied with the constant, I think, struggle of not really, because you will never truly understand what it means to be black in America. Never. You have to acknowledge that. If you don't, I don't think we'll ever be able to pass. You have to know. I believe it in my heart that you do. And, you know, this black pastor told me, you know, I'm sitting in the pew, of course I'm sticking out, and Pastor Bland Jr. looks at me in the audience, and I just felt like he was just looking at me, but, you know, if you're a good pastor and you know what you're doing, you always think he's just talking to you. And he said, you know, our country is not divided, it's disconnected. And when I think about that, I think about the fact that we continue to disconnect because we allow segregation to live and breathe in a way because, you know, people are more comfortable that way, right? You hear people say, well, that's not my fault. I'm a better public servant, a better American, and everything because I went to a beautiful, diverse high school, you know, because where I lived, that's the high school you had to go to. We all went to those neighborhood high schools. There was something beautiful, though, because I went to school with Hungarians and Polish and Latinos and black folks and Muslims and I mean, just all different kinds of backgrounds of people from all different likes. And it was something I think that many of our neighbors across the country will never, ever really experience, and I think it keeps us divided. when I think about this bill, I think about not just, obviously, the importance of diversity and inclusion and trying to make sure that our government is reflective of who we serve. But many of the people we hire, it's also their lived experience. Their lived experience is going to have them lead with some sort of compassion that we'll never again have similar because we haven't lived the life that they have in our country. And I'm not just talking, I'm talking about all different backgrounds. And I just feel like we're in here talking about this in a way that I feel like is just going to continue to divide us. And the acknowledgement that everything's okay. There's no way you haven't been in spaces where you hear it. In the Michigan legislature, Chairman Comer, a man, was a minority witness in the Michigan House and used the N-word in such a derogatory word. My own state representative was in tears afterwards, thinking of her child, her beautiful, lovely son, adult son, but just thinking, my God, he thought that it was okay, that he was somehow emboldened to use that word in the people's capital in Lansing, Michigan. We have a lot of work to do. I just think this is not it. We got to make sure that we're focusing. No, really, we got to make sure that we're putting people in the room. That sometimes we got to make sure they are in the room together, because they're not going to come in the room together unless we require it or urge it to happen, because we know if we do that, then all the services, the way we move as a federal government, will be reflective in a way of leading with that compassion I think that is needed. I just urge us to please just step back and understand that. And I'm not going to tell you, I fully understand where you're. I just know that there's no way you don't know that racism is very clear in these spaces, especially here in an institution that wasn't ready for someone like me. And sure the heck sometimes isn't even ready for the American people, our own neighbors across our country, that will have to be inflicted in coming to get whatever services. God, it's something beautiful if they can look at somebody that is reflective of them and understand their lived experience. And I think we're getting farther away from that. And I know you don't see it, but I'm an attorney. I read this. You're going to allow these protections to fall apart when you do this kind of legislation. You will. It'll allow these protections to fall apart because you're going to allow people to get fired. Fired solely because you're dismantling, again, a policy and a process of creating a culture, again, that's reflective of our country. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Which one do you want, Crockett or Moskowitz? I think Frost and Frost. I'm going by Mr. Raskin. Moskowitz.
So
recognized.
So I really have a question for the sponsor. So I've been sitting and listening and trying to hear your intent and talking about discrimination. But the problem is that argument falls apart on page 6, line 17 through line 20. And in fact, if you're sincere about your intent of the bill, what I would tell you is you should delete those lines. Because actually those lines are actual new discrimination. See, you want to get rid of an office. We may disagree with it, but you can get rid of an office. You want to change policy, we may disagree with the policy you want to change, but here actually, in those lines, you are creating second-class federal employees. You're creating new discrimination. May not transfer, discrimination. May not reassign, discrimination. May not redesignate any employee, discrimination. Those are protections that every other federal employee in every other office in the federal government gets. It's a right and a privilege that they get. But you're going to remove that from these people, not an office. Fine, I disagree with it, but it's an office. Not a policy. Fine, we disagree with it, it's a policy. This is people now. Now you're going to the people. You're saying, because you worked in an office that we don't think should exist, because you worked there, we're going to remove protections that every other federal employee gets, but not you, because we disagree with the office you worked in. That is straight up discrimination. And so listen, If you're serious about wanting to change the office and the policy, you should remove those lines, because the entire argument falls apart when you want to treat the people who work there completely different than anybody else. You want me, and I'm happy to yield the rest of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moskowitz, and thanks for that powerful statement. That was the thing that jumped out at me when I first read this. This wasn't just a change in programmatic direction. It was an attempt to strip federal workers who were doing nothing other than their job, as it was defined to them and described to them, of essential civil service protections that occur to everybody who works in the civil service. And again, there's a general regulation that deals with that. There's one specifically for veterans, saying if a veteran is working for an office, say it's one of these offices that closes, that veteran has the opportunity to be reassigned to another job that he or she is qualified for, doing not the same work, but the new work of the new office. And yet, this seems to paste a scarlet letter on them saying, you worked in now the politically incorrect, ideologically disapproved office, the reviled DEI office, and now you're going to have less rights than everybody else in the workforce. You'll be fired. And it does sound like from the author, at least they could reapply. I think it would clearly violate equal protection in the First Amendment for them not even to be allowed to reapply. But why would we set up a two-tier system where there are people who work in the federal government and then people who worked in the federal government for DEI? And it does, I think, cast a pall over the whole legislation, which obviously is touching, a lot of nerves. And, Mr. Cloud, I respect, the spirit with which you offer this legislation, and I respect the fact that you are not in denial of what so many of our members want to point out, which is that our history is one that begins, of course, with slavery and the denial of rights of African Americans. In the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Taney, unfortunately of Maryland, said that the African American has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And then even after the Civil War, we fought a whole war to overthrow the system of white supremacy, to emancipate people from slavery. Still, the Supreme Court said in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson that it was perfectly okay for government to segregate people according to local racial customs. And we know that that means discrimination and second-class services. So the legislation you offer is part of a long history and goes back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'll yield back to you, Mr. Moskowitz.
Just for claiming my time. And so I would want the sponsor to answer that question, because, look, if Donald Trump were to create a new agency, right, and years later, when we get power back, if we were to eliminate that agency or eliminate that office, but we then said those people who worked in this area of government that we disagreed with, they're going to get less rights and privileges than every other federal employee, you would be jumping up and down that we were treating Trump supporters different. And so what I'm saying to you is, if your intent is to change policy, and if your intent is to eliminate an office, we may disagree with that, but don't punish the people who work there and treat them different than everybody else, and then say this is about trying to change discrimination. I yield back.
All right, gentlemen, time's expired. I think we go back and forth.
Do you want me to answer?
If you want to answer the question, feel free.
Sure. The first thing I would say is sometimes in Washington, and this is a bipartisan issue, we can tend to think that the American people exist to support the federal bureaucracy. I do not adhere to that belief. I think the bureaucracy exists to serve the American people. Having said that, we do want our federal workforce treated right and properly and justly. I would point out that this legislation does what it upholds the Civil Rights Act. The first title, it goes through and virtually says the same definitions about what discrimination is. The reason and the intent behind that is, and I'll give you one example, the Department of Health and Human Services currently has 294 DEI employees costing the federal taxpayer about $38.7 million in taxpayer funds. Now, we can debate whether we think the program or the office has merit. My viewpoint is that for all what the altruistic purposes may have been, as some of the quotes and studies I've read, it's having even an adverse effect at best, or at best it's having a negligent effect and possibly having an adverse effect toward the stated goals. So having said that, I'm thinking, okay, in the example of HHS, we have a $38 million office that is actually having an adverse effect, and that $38 million burden shouldn't be on the American taxpayer. That's how my calculus is working. I did not, Mr. Garcia, I wish he was here because he made the comment that we were trying to get rid of DEI officers because we were going after Mr. Trump's enemies. His words, not mine. I did not view DEI officers as Mr. Trump's enemies. That was a new idea to me, a new concept that apparently he thinks that DEI officers are Mr. Trump's enemy. I think that would be an issue if they were. I didn't think that they were. But having said that, you know, if you wanted to offer an amendment and that would help you get to support of this bill, if you thought that would make the difference,
That's the First Amendment coming. That's my amendment.
okay.
So we can get there.
And if it passes, will you vote for it?
But I'm definitely voting for the amendment. I'm introducing
I mean, for the bill?
Oh, well, I'll have to look and see what happens to your bill. There are more amendments coming.
Ms. Crockett,